Hello, historians. Today we are going to talk about American reform at the turn of the century. There are a lot of terms here that we're going to discuss today, so I want you to be listening and watching, looking specifically for the definitions or examples or some sort of information on each of these terms. Populism, progressivism, the Gilded Age, immigration, urbanization, jazz, industrialization, emerging classes, and Black activism. So go ahead and write those terms down on your notes so that you have that information ready to go. And as I'm lecturing and giving you information, you're jotting down words, keywords, definitions, anything that pops out to you. Now, I've recorded this lecture so that you can pause it as you need to take notes as you follow along. So if you need to pause to write those terms down in your notes, go for it right now. All right, let's get started. As always, I am your host and professor, Dr. Summer Cherland. Let's start with a 1 minute write. You know I like to do these. So I'm going to read you this quote, and then I'm going to have you pause the screen and write your reaction to this quote. The many problems associated with the Gilded Age, the rise of unprecedented fortunes and unprecedented poverty, controversies over imperialism, urban squalor, a near war between capital and labor, loosening social mores, unsanitary food production, the onrush of foreign immigration, environmental destruction, and the outbreak of political radicalism confronted Americans. Widespread dissatisfaction spurred the progressive era, named for the various progressive movements that attracted various constituencies around various reforms. Americans had many different ideas about how the country's development should be managed and whose interests required the greatest protection. Reformers sought to clean up politics. Black Americans continued their long struggle for civil rights. Women demanded the vote with greater intensity, while also demanding a greater role in society at large. And workers demanded higher wages, safer workplaces, and the union recognition that would guarantee these rights. Whatever their goals, reform became the word of the age. And the sum of their efforts, whatever their ultimate impact or original intentions, gave the era its name. All right, what I want you to do is pause the recording and consider the above quote. Which of the topics listed, reformers cleaning up politics, Black Americans continuing a long struggle for civil rights, white women demanding the vote and a more equal role in society, workers wanting union recognition to secure better pay and safer workplaces, etc. Which of those things listed in that long quote I just read you interested you the most and why? So go ahead and pause the recording, write for at least a minute, and come back when you're ready. So there were a lot of terms in that quote that you saw represented on the first slide and that you probably read or picked up in the reading that might not be completely familiar to you. So I'm going to go through some of these terms. I'm going to start with the broader terms, kind of outlining the context of the era, and then get into some specific examples of reform. So let's start with this concept of the Gilded Age. So the Gilded Age is a term used to describe the tumultuous years between the Civil War and the turn of the 20th century. You may have also thought of this era as the Reconstruction era, right? But Reconstruction ended a little earlier than the Gilded Age era. These eras tend to overlap. It depends on how the historian, you, are looking at that moment in time and what aspects of American history are interesting you the most. So this term Gilded Age, it comes from a book written by Mark Twain. And Mark Twain was a political commentarian and a satirist who wrote about problems that he recognized in American history. And especially in this moment where he called it the Gilded Age, he's talking, do you know what that word gilded means? Does that word gilded sort of represent anything to you? It's not a term we use a lot anymore, but it has to do with this concept of a veneer. So for example, I'm wearing earrings today, right? And these are pearl earrings, but they're not real pearls. They're fake pearls. They are cultured, right? Meaning they're made out of synthetic material, and then they're covered with like an iridescent shine that makes them look like they're pearls. So the concept of gilded is essentially a regular piece of material that's been dipped in like a gold foil to give it a gold look without it actually being gold. And that was Mark Twain's point, was that America looked as though it was dipped in gold. It was shiny and beautiful and everything seemed to be going really well. But underneath the surface was just plain old ordinary and in some ways problematic reality, okay? At this time, during the Gilded Age, post-Civil War, we're looking specifically in areas of the urban Northwest or Northeast for the most part. America, the country, becomes more prosperous and saw an unprecedented growth in industry and technology. So there were some really great, exciting things happening in America in the late 19th and early 20th century. But at the same time, it was also a period where greed and corruption ran rapid. Greedy, corrupt industrialists, bankers, and politicians really benefited greatly during the Gilded Age, and usually at the expense of workers and sort of the common man and woman. This is a time of rapid industrialization. This means that large factories are being built at very fast rates. Manufacturers in the largest industries at the time, such as steel and oil refining, were actually pushed aside by newer factories and complexes that were sometimes employing 15,000 to 20,000 workers. So we have very rapid industrialization, factories and workplaces going up really fast and an increasing demand for new labor. These new plants, these new factories that were replacing steel and oil were places that were producing things like automobiles and farm machinery, electrical equipment, textiles, meaning clothing or fabric, and many other goods. Well, all these factories required people to run them. So from 1880 to 1920, America recruited and received more than 20 million immigrants. Family members of my own, right, from my own genealogy arrived in the late 1880s. Some of your family members may have, or they may have migrated from the South or from Latin America around this time as well, or more recently. Oftentimes, these kinds of waves of immigration are caused by either people fleeing something at home, they're fleeing war or poverty or drought or violence, right? Or they're being drawn to something in America, they're being pulled. So they're either being pushed or pulled. And the 1880s to 1920 was a really unique time in American and global history because immigrants were being pushed because of religious persecution or violence or poverty out of their home countries. And they were being pulled to places like America that had access to things like great jobs and wealth. So by the 1890s, most immigrants in America were from these places: Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe, Latin America, or China, and other parts of Asia. Where do all these people go? Well, most of them are not moving to the countryside. If you were to look into my own family's genealogy, most of my ancestors actually moved to like the Dakotas to be farmers in the 1880s. That's kind of a rarity, actually. Most people, when they immigrated to the Americas from places like Eastern and Central Europe, Latin America, or China, were coming to cities. They were going to places like New York City, Chicago, San Francisco, those kinds of places, north and west urban sites. Urbanization is a term you see a lot during the Progressive era, and this is the process by which large numbers of people become permanently concentrated in relatively small areas, and they formed cities. So we think of cities like, you know, downtown Phoenix, of these like big structures, but really what forms the city are the people who live there. When there are larger populations of people in smaller areas, this means that the labor force, the factories that are drawing on these migrant workers or immigrant workers, have access to a huge pool of labor. They have access to lots of people who want jobs, and the competition goes up. So these immigrants are attracted mostly from Europe, but also through Latin America and also rural areas of the American South, by the promise of paid work. They're showing up in these cities, but they're not finding the kinds of housing conditions that a lot of us have grown accustomed to today. They're living in crowded, polluted slums, some of them renting a bed for a few hours so that they can go to work the next day. They're really kind of concentrated in places that are unhealthy, full of refuse, disease, and rodents. And that's because these cities, when they built the infrastructure of the cities, they were designed for commerce and trade and factory work. They were not designed for comfortable living, right? So there were very few accounts taken when it came to public health needs. So things like sewage, right? What they didn't have like running water and toilets the way we know of today in the 21st century. So a lot of people would just like collect their wastewater and waste material, and they would just throw it out the window onto the street. So think about how gross those cities must have been and how unhealthy they must have been for these newly arrived workers. What they did do, even though there was no privacy, there was little recreation, there wasn't a whole lot of health or safety or security, these cities did expand quickly and rapidly. Another aspect of the Gilded Age was the emergence of classes. There were these profound economic changes happening in the United States, which led to social and cultural transformation. Most significantly, the emergence of the wealthy versus the non-wealthy, right? So mostly in the rapidly industrializing North, this was a very significant development. And I've chosen a very famous sort of political economic cartoon done during this time. You can see sort of like the swollen wealth of some people and how they become sort of controlling or influencing of the government. This unequal distribution of newly created wealth spurred new distinctions and divisions along class lines. So you had the very wealthy and you had the very poor, and they looked at things like slavery, work health, child labor, right? They looked at those kinds of things in completely different lenses based on their class. It's in this environment where you begin to see a rise for the call of reform, because concern emerges from many Americans who believe that there was really some significant change that needed to happen in order to protect everyday people. There were a lot of, in particular, white Protestant women living in the North, and white Orthodox Jewish women as well, and sort of the more modern Jewish women as well. And as a result, women and labor organizers begin this concept of reform, this idea that we need to change or shift or adapt to fit the needs of our everyday society. Reformers included people like social workers, journalists, educators, but even politicians. And this was known as the progressive movement. Think of the root word of that, progress, right? The progressive movement. They're looking towards changing or adjusting or influencing the future as America begins to move forward in a new way. So here are several examples of reform that you're going to see. And remember, I'm asking you to, record or remember a lot of these things. So as you're taking notes, write down things that come up for you. The very first thing is this progressivism concept, right? Progressivism is, when it's just a little p, it just means sort of a political or social impact or impetus towards progress. But when it's a big P, it has to do with a formal or comprehensive effort to address problems that arose with the emergence of this modern society. Think about it. The United States the population had doubled between 1870 and 1900. That's 30 years, and the whole population of the entire country had doubled. Because of urbanization, the move of people into these cities, and immigration, the move of people from all over the world, it had increased at such rapid rates that Americans were beginning to see significant shifts, right? And they're also seeing shifts in things like manufacturing and commerce and the rise of these very wealthy corporations. So another example, from 1863 to 1899, manufacturing itself, production rose by more than 800%. So the progressives sought to purify the government. They sought modernization. They looked at a focus on family and education, prohibition, which we'll come back to, and women's suffrage. So they looked at those aspects as a way to sort of combat or address the problems that were coming from this influx of people, the rise of city, and the rise of wealth. So they're looking to purify the government, modernize society, focus on family and education, prohibit the sale of alcohol, and allow women the right to vote. Out of the progressive era emerges the populist party, right? And the term populism, which actually kind of came back into vogue in the last 10 years or so in our own contemporary culture, the term populism can designate either democratic or authoritarian movements. Now, democratic, means that every single person has a vote in the overall decision, right? Authoritarian means there's one person who's kind of in charge of the whole thing. Typically critical of political representation, populists don't like anything that comes between the people and their government. So they either want a top-down government with the guy in charge, as authoritarian, or they want equal access or equal democratic sort of approaches. Representation is what we have, where we vote and our representative votes on our behalf based on what we agree to. In its most democratic form, populism seeks to defend the interests and maximize the power of ordinary citizens through reform rather than revolution. And this populist movement during the Progressive era gave rise to the Populist or People's Party in 1892. Many of the party's demands were later adopted. So populism, though it was a short-lived kind of moment in American history during this period of time, and the Populist Party, which started in 1892 and sort of dissolved over the course of the next 13 to 15 years, they nonetheless influenced the Constitution of the United States for decades and centuries to come, right? Through things like constitutional amendments and a progressive tax system. Their demand for direct democracy through popular initiatives and referenda became a reality for most United States states. Meanwhile, let's talk about something fun that's happening. In New Orleans, a new musical genre is being born, jazz. Now, jazz is a uniquely American art form. It emerged in America. It did not come from anywhere else, which is very rare. If you look at a lot of American customs and culture, a lot of it doesn't come from America itself, right? It's sort of adopted and Americanized. But jazz is uniquely American. It began in the early 20th century in New Orleans, and it as a result of the diverse population in New Orleans of African, French, Caribbean, Italian, German, Mexican, American Indian, and English sort of insiders and people who are contributing to this. Essentially, it's an African-American musical tradition that then mixes and blends with other cultures, and gradually jazz emerges from a blend of what was called ragtime, blues, and other kinds of music. At first, jazz was sort of performed in nightclubs for dancing, but then it was recorded by 1917, and these recordings began selling rapidly all throughout the United States. I've listed several brilliant musicians who led the jazz evolution and revolution: Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Charlie Parker, Miles Davis. But there are several. So if you're interested in music history, you should look up the evolution of jazz. And jazz then quickly spreads throughout the United States and into the global economy, making jazz one of the United States' greatest exports in history. Jazz accompanies a rise of Black activism, and this is because, as you already know, African Americans during the post-Civil War era are facing consistent racism, and racism is taking a lot of different forms at the time. Segregation in public places. You've learned about drinking fountains till you're blue in the face. It's more than drinking fountains, right? We're talking about segregation when it came to housing. Even in Phoenix, Black people could not own or buy property north of the Salt River, north of the railroad tracks, right? So they're not accessing the more sort of attractive housing with things like plumbing, right? So they're segregated in public spaces, housing, employment, healthcare, and education. African Americans are disenfranchised from the political process. They're being drawn out of voting maps. They're being violently assaulted when they try to vote. They're being taxed or asked to pass ridiculous tests in order to cast a vote. They're also facing violence, white supremacy, and lynching at this time. So to counter these injustices, African American reformists emerged to expose and then fight for equal rights in the United States. It's no accident that this is the era when the NAACP was born, right? It's no accident that this is the era when historically Black colleges and universities began emerging. This is an era of reform. And what about women? Women, depending on where you are, right? Women, in particular white women, stood for these three things. Suffrage, they wanted the guaranteed right to vote under the Constitution. Immigrant and family reform, they wanted to find ways to Americanize immigrants into, and their version of Americanize, of course, into what they believed was sort of proper white society. So you have a huge sweeping era of educational reforms led by white Protestant women. And they're seeking to prohibit the sale and manufacturing of alcohol. primarily in cities. Remember I mentioned kind of briefly that cities didn't have like recreation or fun things to do. It was just like work and sleep. Well, because of that, there's a rise of kind of alcoholic behavior where workers of all races and backgrounds begin kind of relying on alcohol as a way to release tension and have recreation, have fun, right? Well, white women didn't really like this. They didn't really think that this was proper. The idea of like men just sort of teeming in the streets, drinking mugs of beer. And so they sought to sort of stymie the tide of alcohol and keep keep the sale and manufacturing of alcohol under control, particularly by the federal government. So prohibition becomes their third kind of tenet or goal for women's sort of rights and activism. So those are a bunch of examples. And now I want to hear from you. This week, you were asked to watch an episode of the 24-part series, America in the Gilded Age, and then you wrote a short film review. So in small groups or on your own, I'd like you to address these questions. What episode did you watch? Was it good? What did you learn? Why should your fellow historians consider watching it, or why shouldn't they? What additional questions did it spark for you? And which of these vocabulary terms that I've described in this lecture just now seemed most pertinent to your work this week? All right, I look forward to hearing from you.